here, but thank you everybody for attending this conversation. For those that don't know me, I'm Ben. I'm one of the co-founders of Formsort. We're a really powerful form builder, and we make it easy to test and improve on your most important forms of your business. Think like patient intake, onboarding, and other use cases. One of the topics we get asked about a whole bunch is building and improving on your growth experimentation engine in your business. And so we're really excited to have Sam from Mindbloom and Karim from Pearmill here to talk to you about their practices and share some of their learnings as practitioners who own these sort of growth experimentation engines. Before I turn this over to them to introduce themselves, a couple quick logistical notes. We're going to share materials from this event a few days after the event. So look out in your email. There'll probably be some things we send along. And we'll also try and save some time for Q&A at the end. We have a whole bunch of material to share today, but we definitely want to give you all the chance to ask questions. We'll probably answer those questions at the end. And with that, I'll hand it over to, I guess, Karim to introduce yourself and get things started.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Ben. Appreciate the setup. Everyone, I'm Karim. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at Pearmill. Briefly about Pearmill, we're a performance marketing agency that operates on paid advertising channels, specifically paid search and paid social. So Meta, TikTok, Google, Bing, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that's really interesting to us, and like in our line of work, is that when we work with a lot of different partners, we get to see a lot of different growth processes run, and we have our own that we tend to overlap with our partners. And generally, the strongest performing companies tend to have really tight, strong processes. And one of our partners has been Mindbloom in this space, and they'll Sam and I will get into the processes that we have, but first I'll let Sam introduce himself and Mindbloom.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Sam. So I run product growth at Mindbloom. So just a little bit about Mindbloom. Our mission is to transform lives, to transform the world. The way that we do that is by offering access to psychedelic therapies, right now, primarily ketamine therapy. And yeah, since I've joined the company, it's been just astounding to see both through clinical trials as well as through client testimonials on a weekly basis of people who are struggling with mental health and who are struggling with anxiety and depression and whose lives are actually completely transformed. So yeah, it's been a real pleasure joining this company. Mindbloom is around 60 people in terms of on the corporate staff side. And since I've joined the company, we've been able to run numerous experiments and improve our acquisition funnel by over 80%. So our conversion rate by over 80%. So yeah, it's been a huge lever for us to drive more value for customers and also ultimately help the business. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Sam. All right, so I'll walk through a bit of what we've prepared for. For today, we're going to be going through the process, an example of a process, and how that process has been implemented with 2 experiments on the Mindbloom side, and specifically conversion experiments. And so the idea is to get an understanding of, one, how we follow along the different steps, and actually technically how that has manifested in 2 different experiments with different results that we'll get into. And I think what's important to first get into is kind of talk about the life cycle of an experiment, and why it's important to have a process like this to begin with. Ultimately, every company that we work with ends up having a bit of a different process, and that's kind of the outcome that we're hoping for this call is for this webinar is that people walk away having a bit clearer of an idea of how to implement a growth and experimentation process in their team. What we'll walk through is a bit of an overlap of what works for Pearmill and what's for Mindbloom, and then more specifically what works for Mindbloom. But it's not meant to be something that works for every company. The process, just anecdotally, the process that we had at Pearmill 3 years ago is very different than the process that we have now. It's just we have at different stages, we have different priorities. And I'm sure at the Mindbloom side that has changed and developed over time as well. So part of an important part of the process is developing it as it goes, and not to get too meta, but maybe you want to consider having a process for processes. But generally, in our case, what it's followed is 5 different steps. And the execution of where each of these steps is where you can have some, liberty and freestyling, like how you individually will predict and prioritize, how your team does analysis and decides winner and everything. And the reason, to go back to it, that it's important is more so than tactics and getting just, ideas of things that work. A sign of a really strong growth team and product team is a team that has built a machine that continuously generates ideas, executes on them, and analyzes and learns from them. So an individual tactic is great, but spending the time and effort to work on a process that continuously generates them, so that ultimately you can get more learnings, your intuition becomes stronger, your customer base grows. That's what's really important in a marketing team's process. And then something that Sam and I were talking about yesterday, that was kind of really refreshing to hear from Sam, is as we go through this, we tend to talk a lot about like numbers and the control and variance and like this significance and Bayesian models and everything. But ultimately, the result is you're dealing with real people going through your funnel. And in the case of Mindbloom, this is an improvement in your conversion funnel, means that one more person can have access to something that is potentially life-saving to them. And there's almost like a responsibility that you have to build a really healthy and strong process as a marketer to give better access to some of the people that might be in need of your product or of your service. So we start off with ideation. We go into, which is essentially determining what it is you want to experiment on. We go into prediction and prioritization of the ideas of all the things that we have in backlog. Implementation, which is actually doing it and running the experiment. And then lastly, the funnest 2 steps, in my opinion, the analysis, looking at the results of what we got, why we got those results, and ultimately feeding that all back into the process. So feeding the learnings into a larger tactic, feeding the learnings into your ideation and systemizing things. So we'll start off with ideation here. And this at a high level is essentially trying to come up with what it is that you want to experiment on, the idea or the initiative that you want to go through. And Sam, I'll hand it off to you to talk about how you tend to go about this, how you and the Mindbloom team tend to go about ideation for your side.
Yeah, so I think ideation always starts with what is the goal. So every company obviously has some sort of key results or KPIs or key metrics that they're trying to target. And usually that's on like a quarterly basis or annual basis, whatever that cadence is. So you always obviously have to start with like, what are you trying to accomplish and what metrics are you trying to move? And then I think from there, you have to really think about, the area of the funnel that you're targeting, what is the sample size or the volume of users that you're going to get. And then that kind of speaks to whether you need to do big bets or small bets. So, I mean, I think the key thing there is like, if you have millions of people going through your funnel and you have that sort of volume, then you almost don't even need to think too much about what you're going to run. You just got to like put a bunch of ideas on the wall, like do a brainstorming session, like every idea that everyone has, you just run them because you're going to get to statistical significance. You're going to know the results of that experiment really quickly. But if you don't have like huge volume like that in the millions and you're kind of more in the thousands, then you have to increase, you have to increase the thoughtfulness by which you, place down bets. So the ideas first have to, drive a larger impact Because one of the things is, if you are able to drive a larger impact, you're actually going to get to, the conclusion of that experiment a lot faster. Because you're obviously going to move the needle a lot more. And then more importantly too, even for your business, if you don't have that sort of volume, you're usually, earlier stage, really trying to grow your business. And so you really want to obviously maximize the impact that you can have to accomplish the goals that you're going to do. So I think when we talk about ideation, it really starts with that. And one thing that I found, it's a very simple framework, when we're thinking about ideas, but it's called the fog behavior model. And it's kind of the graphic on the right. So really, the fog behavior model says that there is a point at which users are going to activate and actually utilize your product or utilize your service. And the two things that govern whether a person is going to actually use your product or service is ability and motivation. So how easy is it for them to do it, and how much do they want to do it? So like a quick example is photography. Before phones incorporated cameras, photography was very hard to do. You had to buy a lot of gear, you had to learn a lot of knowledge in order to do it successfully. And so there were less people that did it. So, while someone had to have a lot of motivation before camera technology was implemented into phones to take up photography because it was very hard to do. But as cameras got incorporated into phones, now everyone is a photographer. You have access to a camera literally in your pocket. You have access to tools and technology to edit photos very easily. And so as the ability or the ease at which people to get into photography became easier, more people activated and actually got into photography. And so when you think about it fundamentally, the two things that drive anyone to convert, in its most simple basic form, is how easy, what is the friction involved in actually becoming or using that product, and what is my desire, what is my motivation to do it. So as growth product folks or people that are running experiments, the two levers that you're primarily pulling is, how can I increase the motivation? How can I make it more desirable for someone to purchase or use my product? Or secondly, how can I make it easier for a person to use my product? So it really, really starts with that in terms of just like on a high level from an ideation standpoint. And then from there, step two, you really have to understand your data quantitatively and qualitatively. So on the quantitative side, it's really understanding the metrics, the funnels, the drop-off points that customers currently have in your acquisition journey. And then on the qualitative side is really talking to the customer. So one of the things that everyone needs to really think through and understand, and this is an example of our paid acquisition growth loop, but it's really probably applicable to a lot of people in terms of just different products and services that people may provide. But everyone may not be familiar with growth loops, but growth loops was popularized by Brian Balfour and Andrew Chen, who are some of the biggest thought leaders in terms of product growth. But really understanding what is the growth loop that you're trying to optimize. And so this is an example of a paid acquisition growth loop. So kind of walking through it. User clicks on an ad, and then some percentage of those users visit a landing page, some percentage click on the main CTA, some percentage provide the email, some percentage complete Formsort. In our case, we're using Formsort for like a candidate survey. Some percent of those users create an account, some percent start checkout, some percent add payment details, some percent complete purchase, and then all of that increases your budget to buy additional ads. So it's one of those things that each cycle that this happens, your overall, you're basically feeding the loop. You have more money in the next cycle to spend on acquiring more users. And so this is kind of one of those loops that continue to feed into itself. But each of these steps, you have to understand the drop-offs. You also have to understand qualitatively, where are the friction points? Where are the customer, where is the customer struggling? And so a lot of that happens by just talking to people. We hop on calls with people who are prospective leads or people who have converted, and we ask them, hey, what are some of the things through this funnel that you really struggled with or that were difficult for you to actually understand? So quantitatively, it's understanding and creating that funnel data view that you really see like, okay, hey, like 40% of users are dropping off at this step. And then qualitatively, it's really talking to customers and trying to figure out why are they dropping off at this stage? Are we not clear about our product or service? Are we not giving them clear information? So yeah, that's kind of really on the ideation side. I think those are kind of the two pillars. What is the goal? What kind of bets do I need to make? Do I need to make big bets, small bets? And then on the flip side, what does the data tell us? What does the data tell us on the quantitative and qualitative side? And I think all of these things kind of really feed into ideation.
It's a really great point of like how to narrow down your ideation into the experiments that will most likely have the best impact. Because like ideas are really easy to come up with and everything and really easy to go through, but making sure that essentially it's on the thing that will solve the biggest pain point. And depending on your stage, however many ideas you can execute on, great. But sometimes you can only afford to do one or two ideas, which leads then perfectly into the next step, which I personally think that this is probably the hardest step out of the cycle, is actually determining, after you've ideated what the universe of things that you could work on, determining what is it that you're going to do in like this week or this sprint cycle or over the next quarter. And the reason that this stage is important, not just we call this like the prediction and prioritization. The reason that prediction is really important in this stage, it's not super important to be accurate in the beginning with prediction, but a lot of what happens in the stage is using some level of intuition, which I know, Sam, you'll get into it a bit later. And if we were all like perfect at predicting things, if everyone is a really great predictor, then you wouldn't really need to build out like prioritization models. You would just know like, all right, I have this idea, I predict that it will have this impact. And since I'm really great at predicting, then we just know that we should do this idea first and this idea second, and this idea third, because these are the results that will happen. Unfortunately, it's not that straightforward and not that easy. And prediction is one of the harder things to get good at. But the better you become at predicting, the more you exercise that muscle, the easier it becomes to prioritize and come up with your roadmap for the next few quarters. So Samuel, I think the way that your team predicts at this stage is super interesting, and would love to hear more about it.
Yeah, so I think with prediction and prioritization, obviously it really does start with, what part of the funnel, once you understand that, the quantitative breakdown of where the drop-offs are, you can kind of predict based on looking at that drop-off and gauging expected impact. So expected impact is a function of, as Karim mentioned, it is intuition, but a lot of times too, as you run more and more experiments, it's specific to your company, you're going to see what type of experiments, what type of things that you do, and generally what sort of impact it drives. And over time, that's going to refine your ability to predict impacts. But we do a lot of times use like Google Sheets, and we'll actually like throw in the benchmark numbers, and then we'll say, hey, if we improve this CTA, or if we generally move this something on the page or whatever we're trying to do, we can then kind of predict, okay, how many more purchases will result as a result of this. And so generally what I've done in previous companies too is build kind of what's called a quantitative growth model. And what that is basically just, you have a Google Sheet that has a full breakdown of metrics from, the start of your funnel all the way to the end of the funnel. And then you have some numbers that you can actually change and input. And then from there, you can kind of see like, hey, if I'm able to move the metric at this stage in the funnel, what is the expected impact on total purchases? And that's kind of, a lot of what drives kind of prediction. But yeah, it is kind of intuition based. And then you can use tools like a quantitative growth model to actually drive predictions. From there, once you know what your prediction or your expected impact is going to be, then you have to start prioritizing. So I think with ranking factors, it really comes down to, what we use internally is, you can call it ICE, or, there's other versions called RICE, which includes reach. But we use impact, confidence, and efforts to kind of rank and kind of start thinking through prioritization. So impact is obviously the prediction that you made of how much you think is going to move the needle on the metric that you're trying to move. And so that's the number, and it's anywhere from 1 through 5. Like how much do I think this is going to? So obviously something that you anticipate is going to move the needle by 20%. That's probably going to be a large impact. So you can put that as a 4 or 5. Something that's going to move it by 10 to 20% might be like a 3. And then something lower than that could be 1 or 2. So confidence for us is essentially a risk modifier. What that means is, 1, have you run a lot of these types of experiments before? Do you know with certainty that it's effective in your funnel? If you have, and you know that these types of experiments generally have performed well, then you give it a high confidence score. Like, hey, we ran this before, we know it works. Or do you know anecdotally through talking to other practitioners of product growth in other companies that this really worked for X company and they're very similar to ours? And so that's why we think that the confidence is really high. So confidence is just a modifier on the impact. Like, how sure are you that this impact can actually be realized? And that's usually a function of the experiments that you've ran, and is also a function of talking to other companies or researching other companies to see what has been successful for other companies. And then finally, effort is just a function of how difficult is it to implement this experiment. So something that you can just do by using what you see with WYSIWYG program on some sort of A/B testing platform, very low effort. Something that involves 5 engineers, or probably 2 engineers to implement over the course of a month, very high effort score. So what we do from there is low effort is actually a 5 and high effort is a 1. And so from there, we actually just add up the total from impact, confidence, and effort. So you might get, for example, impact 4, confidence 4, effort 4. That would be score 12. And then from there, we actually use that to rank and adjust different prioritization. But one caveat there is that's ranking like this is an important component to get some sort of data point around what ideas you think are best. But you have to apply a lot of common sense. It has to be based on what you're trying to accomplish as a company. And there's sometimes where things that are low effort, even if the impact and confidence isn't as high, but it's really easy, might be what you do first, because maybe there are less engineering resources available at that time. So it's hey, these are the things we're going to prioritize. So I think prioritization has to be a function of knowing through some methodology what that score is, but also just being smart about what experiments you run in a given time frame. And then kind of the final note on here is betting on experiments. One thing that I strongly believe in a low volume instance where you're not dealing with millions of folks is that it's better to run A/B tests rather than multivariate tests. So I think a lot of times there's this conception of, oh, I have 4 versions of this that I want to test and 4 great ideas. And so you'd be like, oh, we're going to run an A/B/C/D test where you put all 4 of them against each other. Generally, those take a lot longer to get to stat sig. Even if you're using kind of what's called a multi-arm bandit technique, which basically eliminates the worst performers or the ones that are not likely to succeed earlier on, it generally takes a lot longer to get to stat sig. So if you're an earlier stage company, or if you're a company that has generally low volume, it's better to get conclusive, put your best 2 ideas on the plate. And think, critically about which ideas are the best, and run those against each other. Run the control against, that best idea that you have, and you'll generally be able to improve velocity a lot more that way than trying to do this really long, 4-part test of different things that you have ideas on. And I think that generally speaking, for low volume, earlier stage companies, that's the right approach.
Yeah, we when we were talking about this yesterday too, I feel sorry for everyone that I may have talked to in the past before, because I use this analogy all the time, and it's probably old at this point. But early on, you're building, you have a big slab of granite, and you're building a statue. You need to take a big ass hammer and take chunks of it off at a time. and you're not yet at the stage where you're going to start off with like a tiny chisel and fine tuning everything. So like early on when you're doing like multivariate tests of like, you know, like one headline versus another, and then another button color versus another, call to action versus another, just group them into like the best package that you have and take your best swing at it. And then take that first big chunk off, then another big chunk, and then eventually we'll get to the fine tuning with the chisel stage. I also think some people tend to get intimidated at this stage by like, okay, every idea has to have like a confidence. Maybe you don't have confidence in a lot of the ideas because it's new, or we've gone through a few different ranking factors in the past, from some as primitive as like, I just feel really good about this experiment and like have made a really good case to it. I just feel like an intuition, and this is kind of a scored and more of an intuition. Sometimes you could just, it's okay to just be like, early on at least, I know the audience really well, I know this channel really well, let me just try to go for this. We've gone with other models where the person who has had the closest prediction gets to be the one that prioritizes, but then that causes, you know, unfair reins. And so over time, I think the ranking factors change, and don't be too intimidated by this one, but it's a good muscle to like really exercise over time. And ultimately, the good thing about experiments is we have this wording here: successful experiment versus tight experiment. And I actually want to like put a caveat to this, or revise this, is when we're in the implementation stage and running an experiment, if the experiment is set up well and it doesn't get the results that you want, it doesn't do better than the control, that is still 100% a successful experiment. If you get an experiment and it's tied with the control, that is 100% a successful experiment. And if you get one that wins, that also is just as successful as the other ones. You are getting some sort of learning from them. And there's so much, I think the issue of like, one of the hard things about being a growth person, a product person, a marketing person is that you need a lot of perseverance, where a lot of the experiments that you're going to run are not successful, and that is are not like winning experiments, and that is okay, because you'll then feed that back into your prediction model, you feed that back into your ideation, and you'll get to closer ranges. And even, I think, Sam, you were saying at Pinterest, what was the rate of success?
Yeah, so one of my friends was like employee number 50 at Pinterest in product growth as well. And even, you know, Pinterest, you know, San Francisco based, hired like top talent. Only 4 out of 10 experiments that they ran, even in those early days, were actually like move the needle or move the metrics in a positive way. So I think like that's kind of a good way, you know, to think about it. Like your goal, yeah, of course, obviously you want to improve the metrics, but every experiment that you run is an opportunity to learn. And the faster that you're able to learn, the more likely you are to, you know, to launch winning experiments over time. And so, yeah, 100% learning is absolutely critical to improving kind of your growth process and your product growth process.
And so in this case, well, this step is the most fun step, where like after you spent all this time ideating on it, prioritizing where it's going to launch, and like actually building it out, the stage is just doing it, running the experiment. So can you tell us a bit about the experiments that we ran here?
Sure. So these are 2 implemented ideas off of Formsort, and so Formsort offers you know, very easy A/B testing functionality. And so we had 2 separate ideas that we wanted to run. So on the left side, it's about reducing friction. So we just wanted to get rid of any unnecessary steps. So like transition steps like this. Hey, next we have a few questions to ask. We felt like why are we wasting kind of like, you know, even though it might seem minute, you know, hitting next repeatedly, you know, takes a toll over time. And actually, if you see it from a metrics perspective, while the drop off on this specific screen might be low, the cumulative of like doing like 10 of these ends up being like, you know, 2% of users drop off from these unnecessary steps. So we really wanted to look at like, okay, what can we do to reduce friction and make it easier for a user to actually go through the funnel? And then on the right side, or I guess here we're going to talk about the other one later. So yeah, these are kind of like the screens, right? So one thing note is that there is that screen here about ketamine therapy being very effective. So we thought that at this stage of the funnel, it wasn't as important since we actually dramatically improved our sales page, our final page that a user lands on, with a lot more information about the efficacy of ketamine therapy, and saw actually a huge lift, a 30% lift in conversion from that test that we ran, where we kind of revitalized that page. And so, the hypothesis was, hey, like we don't need this anymore in the Formsort and the candidate survey, and so let's reduce that friction. So yeah, we actually removed, these are 5 examples where we removed in total like 9 steps. So our Formsort used to be like, I think 36 steps, which honestly was a little bit too long. And then we brought it down to around 27 steps. So yeah, that was really what was a successful experiment, and we implemented it, and really had a high conviction that this would drive additional conversions, because we look. So I mean, when we talk about prediction, what do we do to predict this result? We broke down the drop off at each of these steps. We added them all up together. We hypothesized how many additional users we're actually going to get to the final checkout screen and checkout flow as a result of that. And then we said, okay, more or less, we're going to see about, I think we said 7 to 10% lift in conversions by just eliminating these like 9 or 10 steps. And that's kind of how we predicted it. And then, yeah, going to the next screen. So another experiment that we ran, so, kind of applying the ideation and the prediction and prioritization, we saw that one of the biggest drop-off points was the first screen, which is very common. Obviously, it's like the landing page essentially of the Formsort. And so, seeing that this was our biggest point of drop-off, we wanted to experiment with different ways to kind of increase the motivation of a customer at this point. And so one thing that's been working really well for us at Mindbloom is sharing a lot of customer testimonials. We've seen that very impactful in other places of our funnel. So we hypothesized that if we're able to throw in a user testimonial and kind of build some social validation right from the very beginning, that we would be able to increase the number of people that complete the first step and subsequently drive more impact. And so in this case, we were very surprised actually, because we actually thought this was going to make an impact, but overall it ended up being a tie. And so, that led to a lot of questions about, how can we better utilize or improve this first step of the user journey to actually, grab the customer's attention. It's very possible too that the drop off that we're seeing are people that are, accidentally click get started, or were very low intent customers. And as soon as they saw that they had to answer a question, they're like, hey, I'm not interested in doing this. So, we've actually tried like 3 experiments now on this first screen and have not been able to move the needle for whatever reason. So, for us, we're starting to think we either have to like make a much bigger bet and do something dramatically different, or maybe it's just that this lever is not as impactful as we thought it was. And so I think going back to even this hat experiment is teaching us stuff over time. It's like, hey, we've tried a few things now on this screen and this first page. So we have to kind of go back to the drawing board and figure out why it isn't as impactful as we think it is. So that's the tide experiment that we had on Formsort.
Yeah, thanks. It's funny, it's like almost 101, like if you put social validation on the page, of course it'll work. People feel like they're validated, it's a trustworthy thing, and they'll go to the next stage, but it doesn't always work out like that. And so you already were getting to that stage, Sam, where you're talking about like the analysis of the results, like not just sure what are the results of the experiment. All right, the first experiment was better in converting. The second experiment was same results. You talked about how in the second experiment you predicted it would be higher, but that wasn't. And so next time you're running experiments on this page, your predictions may be a bit more conservative because that's fed into now your prediction model, which is internally. And then ultimately, why did we get the results we got? Like the analysis of why testimonials didn't do help on that page. You're just saying, maybe it's not really about that page. It's about what happens earlier on the get started button, or I think. And so these are questions that are really, really great to ask yourself, and just generally, not just what is the result, but why the result, and how close were we to what we thought we would get, to then feedback into the system. And you, Sam, your team, you use a sort of a derivation of the like Bayesian model, essentially, to help determine a winner. And that's a really important step, or help determine whether something is a winning result or a losing result or a tied result. I think it's a really important step in actually knowing when do you call an experiment, when is an experiment had its time, and you should just wrap it up and get the learning from it.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, I think when it comes to analysis, you need some sort of tool. It could be Google Sheets if you're very early on. For us, we use Amplitude to track the experiment results. And I actually love Amplitude. I think it's a fantastic analytics product. And yeah, you should always think deeply about the experiments that you ran and why they performed however they performed, because you really need to, over time, grow your learnings and grow your understanding of what is working for your customers and what is not working for your customers. But when it comes to determining a winner, there's kind of two methods. There's the frequentist and the Bayesian method. So frequentist is kind of more traditional. Generally speaking, you need to define a predefined sample size based on your expected impact. And you want to, get to that sample size and know definitively via like whether you hit the statistical significance after getting to that sample size, whether the change you made had a positive impact or not. And then there's a Bayesian method. So the most ideal version of Bayesian method is that you actually have internal data scientists or engineers that are plugging into kind of the Bayesian statistics model every test that you've ran in the past, and over time, you can actually kind of see via Bayesian like what experiments are more likely to win versus not. But for us as a younger company that's starting up, we kind of just use a Bayesian off of CXL calculator. And so CXL calculator, a lot of these free services, A/B test calculators, are basing the Bayesian off of general A/B tests. So it's not as perfect as like knowing exactly yours. But for us as a smaller company, we want to be fast about experimentation. And so if you look at the frequentist model, sometimes the sample size you need is like 30,000, 40,000, whatever. It's huge. And there's just no way that with the volume that we get at the top of the funnel, that would take 3 months for us to get the sample size. And so what we chose to do and what works for us as a company is we use a modified form of just the Bayesian, where if something is 80% likely to be better via the Bayesian model, we implement it as a winner. And generally speaking, we also determine a reasonable sample size that we believe will give us enough signals to know whether this is trustworthy or not. So we kind of like modified and built something that works for us. And the general hypothesis there is that generally speaking, especially if you've run experiments for a long time, you know that if it's 80% likely to be successful and you have a decent sample size, then you're more likely than not going to have a winner. And so instead of just waiting 2 more months to get to like a fully verified frequentist reality of whether this was successful or not, it's better to get your next experiment going. Over time, if you keep having these 80% winners, and sometimes it's higher, like 90%, 95%, you're going to more dramatically move the needle than if you're waiting 3 months to get like 100% certainty. So I think every company is different, and every company should think about themselves. How do you declare a winner? But for us, we kind of use this, and it's been working really well for us, and we've been able to dramatically move the needle that way by running more experiments over the period of a year.
Yeah, I love that. I think a lot of sort of early stage and sometimes even late stage companies get super hung up on statistical significance and just like needing that before moving on to the next thing. And it could be a real, like, as great as it is, as how helpful as it is to determine winners, it can also just cause you to get slower and hung up on things and just wait on things that like you don't need to wait longer on. It's more important to run 3 experiments that you're relatively confident about, rather than one that you're really confident about. Like it's better to just get the 3 through there. And the reason I talk about later stage companies too in this case is statistical significance is just a calculation, and you have to make sure that there's context that is given at all times. And in Page, you can, with some of our campaigns and some of our accounts, you could probably get some statistical significance in 3 days if you're running a certain budget. But are those 3 days weekdays? Are those 3 days weekends? Are those 3 days happening during like some seasonality, some period of seasonality with that account? And you could be driven to get the wrong assumption just by looking at, you know, I had this much sample size, this was the number of conversions, I have 95% confidence that this is the result, I'm going to follow with that, and then not realize that you should have actually put other context around it too, and had the experiment written for either longer or pause it for a period of time and then run it again. So this is in no way like knocking significance calculations or frequentist methods, but in any of these, you need to use some level of context and again, some level of intuition. And the better you build that intuitive model, then the better you build your intuition, then the stronger you could feel about your experiments. And then lastly, this is maybe some people's least favorite part, but I think is super important is the we were talking about this yesterday. It's systematization. I don't think I could say the word systematization. Systematization. Anyways, there we go. Systematization. I think that's a word too. But how do you feed your experiment learnings into a larger strategy? When you're running an experiment, it's just like, you know, you're splitting some traffic, you're trying it on some one channel or something. How do you then take the learning that you have here and build it into your marketing pillars, your marketing foundation, or your product foundation? And I think there's 2 levels of systemization here. One is feeding the learnings back into the process, but also documenting for the rest of the team and like new people to come on board to understand, all right, like for in Mindbloom's case, Mindbloom at this stage, how did we actually get here? Why do we only have 20 questions in the questionnaire rather than 36? And being able to go through and read through the history of the product of the growth team. And so Sam, again, love for you to share a bit about how you think about this step and why it's super important to you.
Yeah, so you know, this sample sheet right here, and you know, one of the things for most of the tools that we're using in terms of just like prioritizing or ideating or building a roadmap or even like this systematization of the experiments, we just use Google Sheets. You know, it's free, it's easy, simple, you know, and so yeah, we basically just catalog every experiment every year that we ran or every quarter or whatever. And so generally speaking, I try to keep it up to date with current experiments, but obviously sometimes like things get busy. And so I try to at least revise it or update it every quarter to include every experiment that we ran. And we highlight anything that was successful at actually moving the needle in green. And then this way you actually have a documented reference, what I call a playbook, of all the experiments that you've ran and what you've taken away from it. What did you learn? What were the results? What are the things that you're going to take away from this for your next experiments? And so this accomplishes 2 things. First, a lot of times you're very busy, so you're going to forget. You know, what did we do in 2022? Especially if you're a company for, you know, a period of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years. So it's kind of like going back and looking at what has been successful can fuel your ideation. It can fuel your thinking on what is actually driving a success in terms of the types of experience you're running. And then the second thing is if you hire additional folks and you want to expand kind of like where you're running experiments, having this playbook allows them to more quickly get up to speed at what is working for your company. And so systematizing this is really just around learning through documentation and through understanding what's working for your company, and then applying kind of that process repeatedly and taking those learnings for every experiment that you run in the future. So one example is I mentioned that testimonial videos. We've seen it very successful in multiple other areas. So we took that learning and said, hey, why don't we try it on the first screen of the Formsort, and you had a hypothesis that that's actually going to improve the needle there. So it's kind of taking those learnings, and sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. But generally speaking, if you increase your knowledge, you'll be able to drive success over time. So, I really do want to emphasize that velocity matters so much because you need to learn as fast as possible. And I think product growth is really around that. Like, how quickly can I learn what is working and what isn't working? And if you want to be successful in product growth, because once again, 4 out of 10 experiments, even at Pinterest, only 4 out of 10 experiments were actually, winning variants. The reality is most of the experiments that you run are not going to be successful, are not going to move the metrics in a positive way. So the name of the game is velocity. How quickly can I learn? And from those learnings, how quickly can I apply and take away those learnings to improve the experiments that we're running at this company to improve the funnel? So yeah, I think that's why systematization is so important. It's because if you just run those experiments and you learn nothing and you don't apply it, then you're basically just starting from fresh all over again. Whereas the whole goal is, how can I improve over time and improve my ability to sharpen my intuition on what is working and what isn't working for my context.
This is really this when you're talking about like going through and reading through the past, it's sort of like just talking about this other fact, but like when you open like your diary or like notes that you've written to yourself when you were like a kid, or like when you're younger, like, oh, this is what I was going through at this point in time, or these are the problems. But at a company level, like, oh, these are the challenges we had back then. Like, oh, right, we did run this experiment, but that was a completely different time. Maybe it's worth running this again, or oh, this was successful. Why haven't we done something? It's so helpful to have this written up and recorded for many reasons. And like you said, like the value of a successful experiment isn't necessarily just a winning experiment isn't just that the result is better. It's that now you have more context and more information to then feed into the next set of things, which ultimately helps growth. So yeah, you don't want to just start from scratch every single time. And generally, I think that's what's so important, just to like wrap up in this case is it really, all these ideas that are here, it's about how you consistently and regularly create these ideas. And so what we walked through is one model of that. I think there are likely things that are in our models that are not relevant to everybody in this company. There are some things that will be relevant. And I think it's just important to like pick and choose, find other processes, like find an artistic process and see how that runs and see if that's relevant to you. But it's just important to have some way to regularly come up with the experiments and initiatives that you want to run. And sometimes that's just internal and you think about it and you just sit down on a Monday beginning of every week and have your own brainstorm and then go through it. Sometimes it's all these documents across shared teams with lots of calculations. Just change it up as you grow and as you learn new things. I really appreciate Sam. Thanks so much for the time walking us through this and walking us all through this. I asked Sam what he wanted to plug. Is there like, people to follow him, and this really shows just like how what cool of a person Sam is and how great what he's working on is. He's like, just plug Mindbloom, talk about Mindbloom. Like it's like you could see really I assume like the motivation from running this process is also just like the people at the end of the day, that like that 2% means an extra 30 people in a day. And
yeah. 100%. I spoke to this yesterday, but like every week there's a story of a person who was like on the verge of potential suicide or was struggling from crippling depression. And to see kind of like Mindbloom transform and help them is a huge motivator for me. And one of the reasons why I love working here. And definitely think that anyone who's struggling with anxiety, depression, or mental health challenges, Mindbloom can offer so much. And yeah, every improvement we make in the acquisition funnel means that more people get access to this care. And that is truly meaningful for me. So yeah, if anything, you should check out Mindbloom. And for if you know anyone that's struggling with these things, Mindbloom can really make an impact. And we have clinical studies to prove that. And as I mentioned, every week, like stories from people out there that are having their lives transformed. So yeah.
It's, super incredible product, super incredible service. I'm sure everyone here has their own just super valuable thing that they're working on that is making an impact in people's lives, and ultimately that's why processes like this exist. And so that's a motivation for that. Ben, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, I think we're over time. I thank you both, Karim and Sam. You guys were awesome. We all learned a ton today, and we're going to follow up with materials for everybody else. If you have questions, feel free to shoot them over. And you'll have all our contact details. Sam, I don't know if there's an easy way to follow you on the internet or something, but if there is, we'll get that from you afterwards and share it with everybody. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. We're going to end this now. Hopefully, we'll talk to you later at some point. All right.
Thanks.
Bye all.